All right, let's talk about one of the biggest economic shakeups in India's recent history, the massive overhaul of the Goods and Services Tax, the GST. We're going to break down what exactly changed, the big ideas behind it, and what it all means for the country's economic road ahead.
This whole thing really kicked off with this one single powerful directive from the prime minister. And this wasn't just a friendly suggestion to make a few tweaks here and there. Nope. This was a clear cut mandate to go back to the drawing board and fundamentally rethink the entire GST system. The number one mission: make it simple, make it easy for absolutely everyone to comply with.
So, here's how we're going to walk through it. We'll start with that mandate for change, and then get into the core philosophy of putting people over revenue. From there, we'll look at the economic ripple effect this is supposed to create, before we touch on some of the real-world concerns, and wrap up with the bigger economic vision for India.
Okay, so let's dig into that mandate. It's super important to understand that this wasn't some gradual bureaucratic evolution of tax policy. This was a very deliberate top-down push to completely reshape the system.
Think about that. A 7-month sprint to untangle what had become a really complex system. And the entire time, the guiding star, the one thing they kept coming back to, was that simple phrase, ease of compliance. That was the goal.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. We get to the core philosophy behind this whole overhaul. It involved a pretty fascinating moral and economic crossroads for the policymakers, something the finance minister actually called a dharma sankat. So, what is a dharma sankat? Well, you can think of it as being stuck between a rock and a hard place, morally speaking. You have two duties that are pulling you in opposite directions. In this case, the choice was, do you focus on securing tax revenue for the government's coffers, or do you focus on putting more money back into the pockets of the people to boost their own well-being and hopefully the entire economy? And this quote from Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, it pretty much tells you everything you need to know about which path they chose. The decision was made to lean towards public welfare, making a big bet that when people have more money to spend, the whole economy wins in the long run. And this philosophy wasn't just talk. It was translated into some really clear principles. The focus zoomed in on the common person, on farmers and on small and medium-sized businesses. They even had an acronym for it, GN, focusing on the poor, youth, farmers, and women. It also meant they started regrouping goods not by some technical jargon, but by how you and I actually use them. Stuff for daily use versus more aspirational purchases. It was a whole new way of looking at it. So that's the why. But how is all this actually supposed to fire up economic growth? Well, the idea was to kickstart a self-reinforcing positive loop, what economists call a virtuous economic cycle. The very first move was to dramatically simplify the tax structure itself. That old, kind of confusing system with lots of different slabs got a major cleanup. The old 12% and 18% rates were largely streamlined, creating a much cleaner system with just a few core rates to worry about. And if you want to understand the sheer scale of the simplification, it can all be captured in one single, really powerful number: 99%. So what does that 99% actually mean? It means that pretty much every single good or service you can think of now falls into just one of three main tax buckets. That is a huge shift toward predictability. For businesses, it makes accounting way simpler. And for all of us as consumers, it means pricing should be more consistent and a lot easier to understand. And here's the theory of how that virtuous cycle is supposed to work, step by step. It starts with lower taxes, which should lead to lower prices. That gives people more purchasing power, right? Which in turn creates higher demand for goods and services. Businesses then respond by ramping up production, and eventually that drives new investment to expand and meet that growing demand. It's a chain reaction that, if it works, can be a real engine for growth. But of course, a change of this size is never a walk in the park. It's not a perfectly smooth road, and there are some pretty significant hurdles and questions that still need to be navigated. Which naturally brings us to the critical question a lot of people are asking. Are the benefits of these tax cuts, the ones that look so good on paper, actually trickling down and being felt by everyone on the ground? And a few key concerns have definitely popped up. First, there's this issue of profiteering, this worry that some companies are just pocketing the tax savings instead of passing them on to customers. Then, even with simplification, some sectors say the compliance burden is still pretty heavy. And maybe most critically, there's the real risk of revenue shortfalls for both the states and the central government, which creates tension over who should pay for what, since they're both pulling from the same gunny bag, so to speak.
So let's just zoom out one last time and put all of this into the context of India's bigger long-term economic goals. Because this is about way more than just tax rates. It's about building a foundation for whatever comes next. At the end of the day, the ultimate goal here is to build a more resilient economy, one that's dynamic enough to attract investment from around the world and robust enough to handle global shocks, all while keeping inflation low and stable for its citizens. This GST overhaul is really seen as a cornerstone for that entire vision.
And when it comes to stability, there's a specific number they have in mind: 5.5%.
That figure, 5.5%, is the inflation rate the government projects these reforms will help maintain. The logic is, by making things cheaper for consumers and boosting the supply of goods, the economy can grow without prices spiraling out of control. It's a really key benchmark for whether this whole thing is working. You know, after all the economic theory and the policy debates, this personal reflection from the finance minister really helps to humanize the massive effort that went into this. It just speaks to the sheer complexity and the high stakes of that 7-month reform process. It wasn't just another policy change, it was a grueling test. And that really leaves us with the central question here. By making a very bold choice to prioritize people over immediate government revenue, India has set its course. The great unknown, the question that time will answer, is whether this big bet will ultimately pay off and build that strong, stable, and fair economy that's envisioned for the decades to come.